Tonight we're talking about medieval people, a group famous for plagues, mud, and deeply questionable life choices, who somehow still managed to get a few things shockingly right. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. One of the most shocking things about medieval society is not the plagues, the wars, or the medical advice that involved prayer and mild screaming. It's the fact that medieval people stopped working constantly on purpose, and somehow civilization did not immediately collapse. Medieval Europe was overflowing with feast days, saints' days, holy days, local celebrations, seasonal festivals, days commemorating events nobody fully remembered, but everyone agreed were worth a day off. Work didn't slow down on these days. It ceased. Tools were put away. Fields were ignored. Productivity was gently escorted outside and told to think about what it had done. And the best part? No one felt guilty. No one whispered, "I should really be doing something right now." No one tried to turn rest into a side hustle. You didn't earn a feast day through burnout. You didn't justify it with the productivity app. The calendar said rest, so you rested. End of discussion. Imagine explaining that concept to modern society without someone immediately asking about efficiency metrics. Feast days weren't just excuses to eat and drink, though that was enthusiastically included. They were pressure valves. Everyone paused together, bodies healed, tempers cooled, grudges softened. You might hate your neighbor for stealing your chicken, but on a feast day, you still had to sit near them, eat the same bread, and pretend you weren't fantasizing about medieval revenge. That alone prevented several murders. In some regions, nearly 100 days a year were non-working days. Modern managers just fainted somewhere reading that sentence. Medieval people, meanwhile, nodded approvingly and asked if there was wine. Rest wasn't framed as weakness. It was obedience. God said stop, so you stopped. And when rest is mandatory, it becomes peaceful. No inner debate, no moral crisis. No, I'll relax once I finish this one last thing, which is a lie humanity has been telling itself since forever. Even lords had to respect feast days. Power loosened briefly. Everyone shared the pause. No emails, no surprise labor requests, no quick favor. Modern culture insists constant work is normal, and rest must be defended like a criminal in court. Medieval society, despite all its chaos, understood something simple. If people never stop, they eventually break. Mandatory feast days weren't lazy. They were preventative maintenance, and honestly, we desperately need them back. After medieval society collectively agreed to stop working more often than seems reasonable, they committed to another wildly impractical idea: never eating alone. Meals weren't private moments of quiet reflection. They were public events, loud ones, messy ones, events where personal space went to die. Medieval people ate together constantly. Families, servants, neighbors, travelers. If you were nearby and vaguely human, you were probably sitting at the table. Long wooden benches replaced chairs, and the concept of "this is my seat" did not exist. You sat where there was room and accepted your fate. Food was shared, bowls were shared, utensils were optional, hygiene was a suggestion. If someone reached across the table and dipped their bread into the stew, that was not rude, that was dinner. If you were squeamish, medieval society gently encouraged you to starve, and yet somehow this worked. Communal meals forced interaction. You couldn't disappear. You couldn't quietly avoid people you disliked. If you had a problem with someone, you had to face them across a table while chewing, which is one of the most humbling conflict resolution methods ever invented. Arguments happened in public. Apologies happened in public. Gossip spread efficiently and then died naturally because everyone heard the story at the same time. No endless rehashing, no group chat spiraling out of control. One meal, one scandal resolved by dessert. Compare that to modern life where eating alone has become the default. People eat while staring at screens, headphones in, existing 3 in from another human being, but emotionally on another planet. Medieval peasants would find this deeply unsettling. Why are you eating in silence? They'd ask. Who are you angry at? Communal eating also prevented isolation. If someone stopped showing up to meals, people noticed immediately. There was no quiet disappearance. Loneliness couldn't hide because hunger has excellent attendance records. And yes, diseases spread. That happened. Medieval people accepted this as the price of community, much like modern people accept terrible posture as the price of smartphones. The medieval table was chaotic, loud, and deeply inefficient, but it created belonging. You were seen, you were fed, you were included, whether you liked it or not. Modern society prides itself on independence. Medieval society prioritized presence. And honestly, the idea that you are not allowed to eat alone sometimes might be exactly what we need. After medieval people finished not working and then loudly eating together, they did something else that would absolutely break modern society. They slept incorrectly, or at least incorrectly, by today's extremely anxious standards. Medieval sleep was split into 2 parts. First, sleep happened shortly after nightfall. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, people naturally woke up, not in a panic, not reaching for their phones. They simply woke up, accepted it, and stayed awake for a while. This period was calm, quiet, reflective, and crucially, it was considered normal. During this waking interval, people prayed, talked, thought, or just sat by the fire, staring into nothing, which medieval society somehow recognized as a legitimate activity. No one said this is insomnia. No one tried to fix it. There were no supplements, no sleep trackers, no advice that began with experts say. After this pause, people went back to bed for second sleep, drifting off again until morning. The body wasn't fighting itself. The night wasn't treated as a problem to solve. It was a rhythm. Compare that to modern life where waking up at night causes immediate existential dread. You glance at the clock. You calculate how many hours of sleep you're losing. You start negotiating with tomorrow. Medieval people woke up at the same hour and thought, the thinking time. This middle of the night, calm was often used for creativity, prayer, intimacy, or quiet reflection. It was a mental buffer zone between the chaos of the day and the obligations of morning. Modern society erased it in favor of artificial lighting, rigid schedules, and the belief that sleep must be uninterrupted, or it has failed. Medieval people didn't label themselves broken for waking up. They didn't catastrophize. They didn't spiral. They simply existed in the dark for a while, trusting their bodies to do what bodies had been doing for thousands of years. Even the language reflected this acceptance. People talked about first sleep and second sleep as separate expected events. Waking wasn't an interruption. It was part of the plan. Today, we've replaced this gentle rhythm with anxiety and blue light. We demand 8 perfect hours uninterrupted every night and act surprised when humans refuse to cooperate. Medieval society, for all its problems, understood something deeply unsettling to modern self-help culture. Sometimes waking up at night is not a flaw. It's just being human. After medieval society finished resting excessively, eating loudly, and sleeping in too inconvenient chunks, it developed an approach to social discipline that modern culture could never survive. Public ridicule with an expiration date. In a medieval village, if you behaved badly, everyone knew. Not eventually, immediately. You couldn't hide. There were no burner accounts, no anonymous comments, no carefully worded apology statements. You messed up, and the entire village processed it together, usually in the same afternoon. This didn't mean constant cruelty. It meant something strangely efficient. People were teased, laughed at, mocked gently or not so gently. And then it ended. There was no permanent archive, no algorithm preserving your worst moment forever. Once the laughter stopped, so did the punishment. Someone cheated a neighbor. Expect jokes. Someone acted arrogantly. Expect songs. Someone made a fool of themselves at the tavern. That story would travel faster than a plague rat, but only briefly. Tomorrow, there would be new news. Medieval memory had a short attention span, and honestly, that was a feature. Compare this to modern society, where one mistake can be screenshot, reposted, analyzed, monetized, and resurrected years later by people who weren't even present. Medieval ridicule was face-to-face, proportional, and deeply uncomfortable in the moment, but mercifully finite. There was also accountability. You couldn't curate an image when everyone knew your actual behavior. Reputation wasn't managed online. It was lived. If you apologized sincerely, people saw it. If you changed, they noticed. Redemption was possible because people were watching you in real time, not through filtered highlights. Even punishment reflected this logic. Stocks and pillories were designed to embarrass, not permanently destroy. The goal wasn't exile. It was reintegration. Humiliate. Correct. Move on. Brutal. Sometimes effective. Alarmingly. Modern outrage culture aims for permanent removal. Medieval ridicule aimed for behavioral adjustment. One wanted correction. The other wants eraser. And because ridicule happened in person, it required effort. You had to show up. You had to face the person. You had to risk being ridiculous yourself. This limited excess. People thought twice before mocking too harshly because tomorrow it could be them. Medieval society understood something deeply inconvenient. Shame, when bounded and temporary, can be educational. Infinite shame is just cruelty with better branding. So no, we don't need medieval punishments back. But the idea that mistakes should have an end date, that might actually be progress. After medieval society finished publicly shaming you for bad behavior, briefly, efficiently, and without screenshots, it also made sure you couldn't confuse anyone about who you were by accident. Enter sumptu laws, the medieval solution to fashion anxiety. You may not wear whatever you want, and that is final. These laws dictated what colors, fabrics, accessories, and styles each social class was allowed to wear. Silk, nobles only. Bright dyes, wealth required. Fur depends which animal and how important you were. If you were a peasant and showed up wearing something fancy, society didn't assume you had good taste. It assumed you were committing a crime. And yes, this was unfair. Let's get that out of the way. Medieval society was not subtle about hierarchy, but psychologically, this system did something incredible. It eliminated status confusion. You didn't wake up wondering how to present yourself to the world. There was no identity crisis at the wardrobe. No panic about trends. No, does this say too much or not enough about me? Your clothes said exactly what they were supposed to say, whether you liked it or not. Modern society pretends it has freedom, but it replaced clear rules with invisible pressure. Medieval people knew where they stood. Today, people spend money trying to appear somewhere they aren't, while pretending that's self-expression. Sumptu laws also killed one modern monster instantly: aspirational consumption. You couldn't dress above your station, so you didn't bankrupt yourself trying. There was no fast fashion cycle convincing you that last season's tunic was embarrassing. Your clothes lasted years, sometimes decades. They were repaired, inherited, and respected. And perhaps most importantly, identity wasn't bought. It wasn't curated. It wasn't announced. It was assumed. Your worth didn't fluctuate with your outfit. Of course, nobles loved these laws because they protected exclusivity, but peasants benefited in strange ways too. There was no pretending, no social theater. Everyone knew who was who, and expectations adjusted accordingly. Modern people would find this horrifying, and understandably so. But medieval society understood something uncomfortable. Unlimited choice does not always equal peace of mind. Strict dress codes weren't about fashion. They were about psychological clarity. And honestly, not having to think about what your clothes say every morning sounds like a luxury. After medieval society regulated your wardrobe and made sure you couldn't accidentally look richer than you were, it did something even more radical. It openly admitted that life was ridiculous. Not quietly, not ironically, loudly, visually, and sometimes with drawings of snails attacking knights. Medieval people did not pretend the world made perfect sense. They lived with death nearby, disease everywhere, and logic taking frequent days off. Instead of insisting on constant seriousness, they leaned into absurdity, like it was a coping mechanism, because it was. If you open a medieval manuscript expecting solemn religious imagery, you're in for a surprise. Along the margins, you'll find monkeys playing instruments, priests being mocked, knights losing fights to rabbits, and peasants doing things that absolutely did not need to be illustrated. This wasn't rebellion. This was acknowledgement. Life is strange. We see it. Let's laugh before it eats us. Humor wasn't optional in medieval society. It was survival gear. When existence is unstable, laughter becomes a pressure valve. Medieval people laughed at authority, at death, at themselves, and at the sheer unpredictability of being alive. They didn't wait for a comedy night. The comedy was built into the culture. Modern society, on the other hand, takes itself extremely seriously while pretending it doesn't. Everything must be optimized, explained, justified, and branded. Medieval people looked at chaos and said, "Yes, obviously." Pass the bread. Festivals amplified this mindset. During certain celebrations, rules loosened. Roles reversed. Peasants mocked nobles. Fools became kings for a day. The social order was temporarily flipped upside down, not to destroy it, but to release pressure so it didn't crack permanently. Medieval people understood that if you never laugh at power, power eventually explodes. Even religion made room for absurdity. Carnivals existed alongside churches. Jokes lived next to prayers. Sacred and silly were not enemies. They were neighbors. This acceptance of absurdity created resilience. When bad things happened, people weren't shocked. They were disappointed, angry, grieving, but not surprised. The world had always been unreasonable. That expectation softened the blow. Modern life constantly promises control and perfection, then acts confused when neither arrives. Medieval people expected chaos and found joy anyway. Accepting that life is absurd didn't make them foolish. It made them durable. And honestly, that might be one medieval trend worth reviving immediately. After medieval society accepted that life was absurd and decided to laugh about it, they did something else modern people find deeply offensive. They lived according to the season, and they did not complain about it online. Medieval people did not expect the world to bend to their preferences year-round. Winter meant cold, darkness, fewer options, and food that had strong opinions about being stored too long. Summer meant heat, work, and bugs that believed your body was public property. And everyone simply accepted this as reality, not a personal attack. Food was the clearest example. You ate what existed right now. No strawberries in winter, no oranges unless someone very important had arranged it. If something wasn't in season, it wasn't unavailable. It just wasn't a thing. Medieval people didn't stand in a field demanding berries from January like the earth owed them customer service. This seasonal mindset extended to energy, mood, and expectations. Winter was slower. People worked less, slept more, gathered indoors, and survived. Summer was faster. Labor intensified. Days stretched longer. Rest became brief and strategic. No one tried to maintain the same pace year-round because that would be insane. Modern society insists every month should feel identical. Same productivity, same diet, same energy. Medieval people would look at this and ask, "Why are you fighting the sun?" Seasonal living also softened disappointment. When something was gone, it was gone. No substitute, no alternative. You didn't scroll endlessly looking for replacements. You adapted. You waited. You appreciated what returned. This rhythm created anticipation. Certain foods mattered more because they were rare. Certain moments felt special because they didn't last. Modern abundance erased that feeling and replaced it with mild dissatisfaction at all times, even emotionally. Medieval people expected fluctuation. Winter sadness was normal. Summer joy was temporary. Nobody tried to optimize their mood constantly. They accepted cycles instead of resisting them. Seasonal living wasn't romantic. It was limiting, sometimes cruel, often inconvenient. But it aligned human expectations with reality, which reduced frustration in ways modern convenience never has. Medieval people didn't ask the world to be comfortable all the time. They adjusted themselves instead. And honestly, letting the year change how you live instead of fighting it might be one of the healthiest medieval trends we abandoned. After medieval people accepted the seasons and stopped demanding strawberries from winter like spoiled customers, they embraced something modern society treats as a moral failure: doing nothing, not resting so you can be productive later, not recharging, just idleness. Plain, unapologetic idleness. Medieval society did not believe every waking moment needed a purpose. There were long stretches of time where nothing happened, and no one tried to fix that. People sat. They leaned against walls. They stared into fires. They watched clouds drift by without documenting it. If you were seen doing nothing, nobody asked if you were working on something in your head. This wasn't laziness. It was baked into the rhythm of life. Agricultural labor came in intense bursts, followed by long pauses. Between planting and harvesting, there were days when waiting was the job. You couldn't rush crops by staring at them harder. Medieval people accepted this. Modern people would attempt a productivity app. Idleness was also social. Villagers gathered with no agenda, no schedule, no reason. Conversations wandered. Silences existed without being filled. Nobody pulled out a device to escape boredom, because boredom wasn't considered an emergency. In fact, boredom had a function. It created stories, songs, jokes, and ideas. Some of the most enduring medieval tales emerge not from ambition, but from people killing time together with nothing better to do. Modern creativity often struggles because boredom has been completely eliminated. There was also no guilt attached to resting visibly. If you weren't needed at that moment, you were allowed to exist without explanation. No one measured your worth by output alone. If your neighbor saw you sitting quietly, they didn't assume you were unmotivated. They assumed you were human. Modern society has replaced idleness with constant stimulation, and then wonders why everyone is exhausted. Medieval people experienced fatigue too, but it came from physical labor, not mental overdrive. Celebrated idleness acted as a pressure release. Without it, tension builds quietly and eventually explodes. Medieval communities understood this instinctively. They didn't monetize relaxation. They didn't brand it. They didn't sell it back to themselves. They simply stopped. And maybe the most absurd medieval trend of all is the one modern life needs the most: the permission to do nothing without apology. After medieval people mastered the art of doing absolutely nothing without guilt, they balanced it with something modern society keeps trying to outsource to machines, moving their bodies constantly for real reasons, not exercise, not fitness, actual work that needed to be done, whether you felt motivated or not. Medieval people did not work out. There was no concept of jogging for fun or lifting heavy objects repeatedly without a practical outcome. If you lifted something heavy, it was because it needed to be moved. If you walked long distances, it was because there was somewhere you had to go. If you were tired at the end of the day, congratulations. The system was functioning correctly. Physical labor acted as therapy without anyone calling it that. Stress didn't accumulate silently in the body. It was burned off chopping wood, carrying water, digging soil, or hauling something heavier than it had any right to be. There was no time to overthink when your arms were already screaming. Modern society has reversed this completely. We sit still all day and then attempt to simulate medieval labor in climate-controlled rooms while staring at mirrors. Medieval people would find this deeply confusing. "Why are you lifting the same stone repeatedly?" they'd ask. "Is the stone cursed?" Physical work also anchored people in reality. You knew what you had accomplished because you could see it. A field cleared, a fence repaired, a load carried. Progress was tangible. No abstract metrics, no performance reviews, no wondering whether your effort mattered. If something existed at the end of the day, it mattered. This constant movement also regulated sleep, appetite, and mood naturally. When your body is genuinely tired, it sleeps. When it's hungry, you eat. When it's satisfied, it rests. Medieval people didn't need reminders to listen to their bodies. Their bodies made themselves very clear. Of course, the work was hard, sometimes brutal. Bodies broke down. Medieval life was not a wellness retreat, but modern society has discovered something worse: exhaustion without movement, mental fatigue without physical release, stress trapped in a body that barely gets to move. Medieval labor wasn't efficient. It wasn't optimized. It wasn't gentle. But it provided something modern life struggles to replicate: a direct relationship between effort and relief. You worked, you were tired, you slept. No interpretation required. And maybe that's why medieval people, despite everything, often slept better than we do. After medieval people finished exhausting their bodies through honest labor and sleeping like rocks, they handled disagreements in a way that would immediately terrify modern society out loud, in public and with witnesses. Medieval arguments did not happen quietly in private messages. They happened in taverns, marketplaces, churchyards, and village squares, places where everyone could hear you, judge you, and remember your worst phrasing forever. If you were angry, the entire community knew about it before lunch. And strangely, this worked. Public debate meant accountability. You couldn't carefully curate your words after the fact. You couldn't edit, delete, or reframe your argument once it left your mouth. If you said something foolish, people reacted immediately. Laughter, groans, or the sudden silence of collective disappointment did the moderating for you. Disagreements were loud, emotional, and sometimes theatrical. Gestures were involved. Voices rose. Someone probably spilled a drink. But crucially, once the argument ended, it was over. There was no endless replay, no passive-aggressive follow-up. No one lay awake at night rereading messages that didn't exist. Because arguments happened face to face, they also required courage. You had to stand in front of the person you disagreed with. You had to see their expression. You had to feel the social weight of your words. This alone filtered out a shocking amount of cruelty. Modern conflict is sanitized and therefore endless. Medieval conflict was messy but finite. People argued, resolved, drank, and moved on. You might still dislike someone, but you weren't trapped in a perpetual state of unresolved tension fueled by silence. Public debate also strengthened communal norms. The village collectively decided what behavior crossed a line. No algorithms, no anonymous outrage. Just human judgment delivered immediately and sometimes brutally. And because everyone was present, power dynamics were visible. A noble yelling at a peasant looked different in front of witnesses. Abuse had an audience. That mattered. Of course, this system wasn't perfect. Sometimes it escalated. Sometimes fists replaced words. Medieval society was not a conflict resolution seminar, but it understood something modern culture has forgotten. Arguments need an ending. When conflict is embodied, it resolves faster. When it's abstract, it metastasizes. Medieval people argued loudly so they wouldn't argue forever. And honestly, the idea that disagreements should happen in daylight, not behind screens, might be one of their healthiest habits. After medieval people finished arguing loudly in public and then immediately moving on with their lives, they lived under a concept modern society finds deeply uncomfortable. Everyone noticed everything. Privacy existed, but only in theory. In practice, medieval villages operated like a small room with no doors and excellent acoustics. If you were doing well, people knew. If you were struggling, people knew. If you tried to quietly fall apart in the corner, the village gently refused to let you. Community responsibility wasn't optional or sentimental. It was practical. Survival depended on it. If someone didn't show up to work, didn't eat, or didn't leave their house for a few days, it wasn't considered their personal business. It was considered a problem that needed immediate attention, preferably before it affected the harvest. This constant visibility meant isolation was rare. Loneliness had very few places to hide. If you were sick, neighbors noticed. If you were grieving, they showed up. If you were spiraling, someone intervened. Not with a carefully worded message, but by physically appearing in your space with food, advice, or unsolicited opinions. Was this intrusive? Absolutely. Medieval people would wander into your home unannounced and comment on your life choices with alarming confidence. But they also wouldn't let you quietly disappear. Neglect was harder. Abandonment required effort. Modern society has perfected the art of being surrounded by people who know nothing about you. Medieval society did the opposite. Everyone knew too much. And strangely, that created safety nets modern systems still struggle to replicate. Community responsibility also meant shared consequences. If one person failed, the village suffered. That created a culture of mutual investment. You didn't help because you were virtuous. You helped because someday you would need help too. And the village had a long memory. There was no outsourcing care entirely to institutions. No assumption that someone else would handle it. Responsibility was local, immediate, and unavoidable. Of course, this system had downsides. Gossip flourished. Judgment was constant. Individual freedom was limited. Medieval people paid for belonging with autonomy. But modern society flipped the equation completely. Maximum autonomy, minimum belonging. And now everyone is shocked that people feel alone. Medieval people understood something quietly radical. Humans are not meant to be invisible to each other. Being seen all the time was exhausting, but being unseen all the time is worse. And maybe the medieval insistence that we are responsible for one another is a trend worth revisiting, carefully, selectively, and with fewer uninvited opinions. After medieval society made sure everyone was deeply involved in everyone else's business at all times, it occasionally decided the best solution was to abandon logic completely and throw a festival, not a tasteful one, not a themed one, a deeply confusing one. Medieval celebrations often made no sense on purpose. There were festivals where peasants dressed as nobles. Nobles were mocked openly, fools were crowned kings for the day, and authority politely stepped aside, while chaos borrowed the throne. These events weren't accidents. They were scheduled releases of social pressure. Take the Feast of Fools. Clergy dressed ridiculously. Rules dissolved. Mock sermons were delivered. Sacred spaces temporarily became playgrounds for satire. This was not medieval society malfunctioning. This was medieval society performing maintenance. Modern culture treats order as something that must be defended constantly. Medieval culture understood that order breaks if it's never allowed to bend. So they bent it on purpose once in a while in a controlled setting where everyone knew it would end. These celebrations also reset hierarchy. For a brief moment, the powerful were laughed at, and the powerless were heard. Not enough to overthrow the system, just enough to stop resentment from boiling over into something sharp and dangerous. And importantly, everyone participated. You didn't opt out. You didn't stand on the sidelines pretending you were above it. The village agreed collectively to suspend seriousness and embrace nonsense. Even people who hated joy were dragged into it. Modern society does chaos accidentally. Medieval society scheduled it. These festivals also reminded people that authority was human, not divine. When a priest stumbled drunk through the square wearing a donkey mask, the illusion of perfection cracked safely, temporarily, and without revolution. After the festival ended, roles snapped back into place. Work resumed. Rules returned. But something had shifted. Pressure had been released. Laughter had softened edges that would otherwise cut. Today, we either suppress frustration endlessly or explode unpredictably. Medieval people chose a third option: ritualized nonsense. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't rational, but it was effective. Celebrations that made no sense weren't about joy alone. They were about balance. And maybe the modern world could use a few days where seriousness is officially cannoned by law. After medieval society intentionally descended into ritualized chaos and then calmly returned to normal, it benefited from something modern life has completely eliminated: slow information. News did not arrive instantly. In fact, it often arrived late, distorted, and slightly confused. And somehow this made people sear. In the medieval world, information traveled at the speed of walking or riding or shouting across a field. If something dramatic happened in the next town, you didn't find out immediately. You might hear about it days later or weeks later, or not at all. And when you did hear about it, it was usually missing details and heavy on opinion. This wasn't a flaw. It was a buffer, because news arrived slowly, panic spread slowly. Rumors had time to die before reaching everyone. Catastrophes remained local instead of becoming everyone's emotional responsibility. Medieval people were not expected to process the suffering of the entire world before breakfast. Modern society receives every disaster instantly and then wonders why everyone is anxious. Medieval people experienced tragedy too, plenty of it, but it was contained. If something terrible happened far away, it stayed far away. Empathy existed, but it didn't crush daily life. Slow information also reduced outrage. By the time news arrived, emotions had cooled. Knee-jerk reactions softened. People discussed events rather than reacting to them. You couldn't doom scroll because scrolling had not been invented. And even if it had been, nothing new would have happened yet. Even gossip had limits. By the time a rumor reached you, it had already been filtered by multiple retellings. The truly ridiculous details often fell away, leaving behind something less explosive and more manageable. Medieval people were not ignorant. They were selective by necessity. Their attention was local. Their concerns were immediate. They focused on what they could actually influence instead of being constantly outraged by events beyond their control. Modern society calls this being uninformed. Medieval society called it survival. There was also less pressure to have an opinion instantly. You didn't need a hot take. You didn't need to respond. Silence was normal. Reflection happened naturally because information arrived slowly enough to allow it. Slow information didn't make medieval life peaceful, but it made it digestible. And maybe the most absurd medieval trend of all is one modern life desperately needs. News that arrives slowly enough for humans to handle it. After medieval people learned news slowly and survived without collapsing under the emotional weight of the entire world, they embraced an idea modern society actively resists. Not everything can be improved endlessly. Some things had limits, and medieval people accepted them with far less internal screaming than we do. There were limits to work, limits to wealth, limits to ambition, limits to comfort. Medieval people didn't expect life to be optimized into perfection. They expected difficulty, scarcity, and failure, and planned accordingly. This wasn't pessimism, it was realism. If a harvest failed, it failed. You didn't write motivational quotes about grinding harder. You prepared better next time and accepted that sometimes the weather simply won. Modern culture treats limits like personal insults. If something doesn't work, we assume we haven't tried hard enough, optimized enough, or believed in ourselves enough. Medieval people would look at this mindset and gently suggest you talk to the sky. Respecting limits also reduced disappointment. When you expect difficulty, you aren't constantly surprised by it. Medieval people weren't shocked when winter was hard. They were annoyed, cold, and miserable, but not confused. There were also moral limits. You weren't expected to do everything. You had a role. You lived within it. This limited freedom, yes, but it also limited pressure. No one asked peasants to reinvent themselves every year. Identity was stable. Expectations were clear. Modern society insists everyone can be everything if they just work hard enough, and then quietly blames individuals when that promise collapses. Medieval society made fewer promises and therefore broke fewer hearts. Even time had limits. Day ended when the sun disappeared. Productivity didn't extend indefinitely into the night. Artificial lighting existed, but was expensive. Darkness meant rest, not hustle. Respect for limits didn't make medieval life comfortable. It made it coherent. People lived inside a framework that acknowledged reality instead of fighting it constantly. Modern life has erased limits and replaced them with endless expectations. Medieval life had fewer options but more acceptance. And maybe the medieval understanding that not everything needs fixing, improving, or optimizing is one trend we desperately need to relearn. After medieval society accepted limits, slow information, ritualized chaos, loud arguments, forced rest, and the general absurdity of existence, it arrived at something modern culture has nearly forgotten. Life was not a project. It wasn't something to be constantly upgraded, measured, or optimized. It was something you endured, shared, and occasionally laughed at. Medieval people did not wake up asking how to improve themselves. They woke up asking whether the fire was still lit and if the bread was edible. Once those questions were answered, everything else was a bonus. There were no 5-year plans, no vision boards, no pressure to reinvent identity every few months. Daily life followed rituals rather than goals. You worked when it was time to work. You rested when it was time to rest. You celebrated when the calendar told you to celebrate. You argued when something bothered you. You moved on when it ended. There was no constant self-monitoring. Modern society replaced this with optimization. Every moment must be useful. Every habit must serve an outcome. Even rest must be productive, or it doesn't count. Medieval people would look at this and ask why you are exhausting yourself on purpose. Living without optimization didn't mean medieval life was easy. It was hard, painful, and often unfair. But the difficulty was external, not internal. People weren't constantly judging themselves for failing to become better versions of themselves. They were just surviving within a world that made no promises. This created resilience. When life wasn't expected to improve endlessly, setbacks didn't feel like personal failures. They felt like life being life. There was dignity and endurance rather than transformation. Medieval people measured success simply. Did we eat? Did we survive? Did we laugh today? If the answer was yes, the day had value. Modern culture insists meaning must be constructed through achievement. Medieval culture allowed meaning to emerge through participation. No dashboards, no metrics, no constant improvement plans, just cycles of effort, rest, community, and absurdity. And maybe the most absurd medieval trend of all, the one that truly needs to come back, is the idea that life does not need to be optimized to be worth living. In the ancient world, sport was never a harmless way to kill an afternoon. There were no pickup games, no stretching politely before exercise, and absolutely no playing just for fun. Every competition existed for a reason, and that reason was usually serious. Survival, honor, religion, or power. When ancient people played, they were rehearsing for life itself. First and foremost, sport was preparation for war. Long before standing armies and professional soldiers, most men were expected to fight when called. Running, throwing, wrestling, and riding were not hobbies. They were battlefield skills, disguised as competition. If you could sprint faster, throw farther, or overpower another man in the sand, you had a better chance of surviving combat. Victory in sport suggested usefulness in war, and usefulness in war meant status. But physical training alone was not enough. Sport was also a ritual act deeply tied to religion. Many competitions were held during festivals honoring gods, ancestors, or cosmic forces. Winning was not just a personal triumph, it was proof of divine favor. To lose publicly could imply that the gods had turned their faces away from you, which was socially inconvenient at best and spiritually alarming at worst. Athletes competed not only before crowds, but before heaven. Sports also served as social theater. They reinforced hierarchy, masculinity, and order. Not everyone was allowed to compete. Free men played. Slaves usually watched. Elites sponsored games to show generosity and wealth, while rulers used grand competitions to display control and unity. A well-run sporting event suggested a stable society. Chaos in the arena hinted at chaos everywhere else. There was also a darker edge. Ancient sports were often violent, public, and unforgiving. Injuries were common, death was accepted, and mercy was optional. Pain was not a flaw in the system. It was part of the spectacle. To endure suffering calmly proved discipline and moral strength. To quit brought shame that could last a lifetime. Most importantly, sport gave ancient people meaning. It created stories worth remembering. Champions became legends, names repeated for generations. Ordinary life was harsh, brief, and uncertain, but victory in competition offered a rare chance at immortality through memory. To win was to be remembered. To compete at all was to matter. In ancient civilizations, sport was not an escape from reality. It was reality condensed into rules, rituals, and raw physical struggle played out under the eyes of gods, crowds, and history itself. If ancient sports had a heartbeat, it thundered through the wheels of a chariot. Chariot racing was not a refined pastime for philosophers or a polite athletic contest. It was loud, violent, and wildly addictive. Across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, nothing drew crowds like the promise of horses sprinting at Lear tracks, pulled inches from disaster by a driver with very little protection and even less margin for error. At its core, chariot racing was a test of control. Horses were powerful, nervous animals, easily panicked by noise and motion. Steering them at full speed through tight turns required nerve bordering on recklessness. Crashes were common, spectacular, and often fatal. When chariots tangled, drivers could be dragged beneath hooves or crushed under splintering wheels. The crowd did not leave in disgust. They leaned forward. This danger was precisely the point. Chariot racing turned risk into entertainment and courage into currency. A successful driver earned fame far beyond what most soldiers or craftsmen could dream of. Some racers became celebrities, their names shouted by thousands, their victories tracked obsessively by fans who supported teams with the enthusiasm of modern sports ultras. Loyalty to a racing faction could define a person's social identity. Yet, the drivers themselves often came from the lowest rungs of society. Many were enslaved or freed men whose bodies were valuable, but whose lives were considered expendable. This contradiction sat comfortably with ancient audiences. Glory could be borrowed, even if humanity could not. When a driver died, another quickly took his place, reins in hand, fate pending. Politically, chariot racing was a useful pressure valve. Massive crowds gathered regularly, emotions ran high, and rulers paid close attention. The racetrack became one of the few spaces where ordinary people could voice approval or outrage directly, sometimes shouting demands at officials while the races paused. A happy crowd was manageable. An angry one could be dangerous. Chariot racing blended speed, spectacle, social tension, and ritualized violence into a perfect storm of mass entertainment. It offered danger without war, victory without conquest, and heroes who might not survive the afternoon. For ancient societies, that balance was irresistible. While chariot racing thrilled the masses with chaos and death, the Greeks pursued something far more controlled and arguably more obsessive: perfection. The ancient Olympic Games were not designed to entertain the crowd first and foremost. They were designed to honor the gods, especially Zeus, by displaying the ideal human body pushed to its absolute limits. To the ancient Greeks, athletic competition was a form of worship. Strength, speed, balance, and endurance were seen as reflections of cosmic order. A well-trained body suggested moral discipline, self-control, and harmony between mind and flesh. This is why athletes competed naked. Clothing would hide flaws, and flaws mattered. The body itself was the offering. The events were deceptively simple: running, wrestling, boxing, pancration, and throwing contests. No elaborate equipment, no safety padding, no mercy rounds. Victory depended on raw physical ability and relentless training. Athletes prepared for years, often under brutal regimens that included restricted diets, repetitive drills, and constant supervision. Pain was not an obstacle. It was proof that training was working. Unlike many other ancient sports, Olympic competitors were free Greek men, not slaves. Participation alone was an honor, and winners gained lifelong prestige. They did not receive prize money at the games themselves, but the rewards back home were enormous. Public meals for life, statues, poems written in their honor, and political influence. A victorious athlete elevated not just himself, but his city-state. However, the Olympics were not the peaceful celebration modern imagination likes to project. Cheating, bribery, and rivalry were common. Athletes swore sacred oaths to compete honestly, then quietly looked for ways around them. The pressure to win was immense because failure meant obscurity. Second place was effectively invisible. Women were excluded entirely, both as competitors and spectators with rare exceptions. The Olympic ideal was explicitly male, reinforcing a vision of society where physical excellence and public honor belonged almost exclusively to men. In the Greek world, sport was philosophy in motion. It was an argument made with muscle and breath, asserting that human excellence was not accidental, but trained, disciplined, and worthy of divine attention. Long before packed stadiums and championship trophies, the peoples of Mesoamerica were playing a game that blurred the line between sport, ritual, and cosmic duty. The Mesoamerican ball game was not designed primarily for entertainment. It was a sacred reenactment of how the universe itself functioned, acted out with a heavy rubber ball and bodies that absorbed its punishment. The game was played across centuries by different cultures, including the Mer and the Aztec, on stone courts shaped like elongated corridors. Players used their hips, thighs, and shoulders to keep the solid rubber ball in motion, a task that was far more painful than it sounds. The ball could weigh several kilograms, and repeated impacts left deep bruises and broken bones. Protective gear existed, but it was limited and symbolic rather than comfortable. At a symbolic level, the ball represented celestial bodies, often the sun or planets moving through the sky. The court itself mirrored the boundary between worlds, the space between life and death. Every match was a ritual struggle to keep cosmic order intact. If the ball stopped, metaphorically speaking, the universe could fall apart. That was the idea, at least. Victory and defeat carried consequences far beyond pride. In some ceremonial games, players, captives, or entire teams could be sacrificed afterward. Contrary to popular myth, it was not always the losers who died, nor always the winners. Sacrifice was considered an honor, a direct offering to the gods. From a modern perspective, this is unsettling. From an ancient one, it was logical. What better gift could you give the divine than excellence followed by blood? The ball game also reinforced political power. Rulers sponsored courts, hosted matches, and used the spectacle to legitimize their authority. A successful game implied divine approval of the ruling class. A failed one could be interpreted as a bad omen. The stakes were cosmic, but the messaging was political. Unlike Greek athletics, the Mesoamerican ball game was not about perfect bodies or individual fame. It was about duty, endurance, and submission to a universe that demanded balance. Pain was expected, death was acceptable, and sport, once again, was not an escape from reality, but a ritual that explained why reality was so unforgiving. In ancient Egypt, sport existed within a worldview obsessed with balance, order, and control. Wrestling, one of the oldest documented sports in human history, fit perfectly into this mindset. Scenes carved into tomb walls and painted on temple reliefs show wrestlers locked in grips, throws frozen in stone, bodies tense but composed. These images were not decorative. They were statements about how the world was supposed to function. Egyptian wrestling was structured, technical, and surprisingly sophisticated. Matches followed recognizable rules with a clear progression of holds, counters, and throws. This was not a chaotic brawl. It was controlled violence meant to demonstrate mastery over the body and symbolically over disorder itself. To wrestle well was to embody Mart, the cosmic principle of harmony that underpinned Egyptian religion and kingship. The wrestlers themselves were often soldiers or men in physical training for military service. Wrestling built strength, balance, and endurance, all essential for combat. But unlike battlefield fighting, wrestling emphasized restraint. The goal was domination, not destruction. Breaking your opponent was less important than proving you could control him. This distinction mattered deeply in Egyptian society. Power was meant to be exercised calmly, visibly, and with purpose. The pharaoh ruled not by constant violence, but by maintaining balance between chaos and stability. Wrestling mirrored this philosophy perfectly. Two men struggled, but within limits. Order always returned at the end. Wrestling also carried ritual significance beyond training. Tomb paintings suggest that athletic skill followed a person into the afterlife. To depict oneself wrestling was to claim eternal vitality, readiness, and worthiness before the gods. The dead, after all, were expected to be judged, weighed, and tested. A strong body symbolized a prepared soul. Unlike Greek athletics, Egyptian sport did not glorify individual fame. Wrestlers did not become celebrities, and victories were not immortalized with poems or statues. The emphasis was collective and symbolic. Skills served the state, the gods, and the eternal order, not personal legacy. In Egyptian civilization, sport was not about pushing limits recklessly or courting danger for spectacle. It was about discipline. Wrestling taught that strength without control was useless, and that true power revealed itself through balance, technique, and calm dominance. If Greek sport worshipped perfection and Egyptian sport worshipped order, Roman sport embraced something far more unsettling: domination through spectacle. Gladiatorial combat was not officially called a sport in the modern sense, but it functioned exactly like one. It had rules, training schools, fan loyalty, statistics, and stars. What separated it from other athletic contests was the ever-present possibility of death, carefully staged for maximum emotional impact. The Roman gladiatorial games were born funerary rituals meant to honor the dead with blood. Over time, they evolved into mass entertainment, funded by elites and emperors who understood one simple truth. Nothing distracted the public quite like violence with structure. Gladiators trained intensely, learning specific fighting styles, weapons, and movements. These were not random brawls. They were rehearsed encounters designed to look chaotic while remaining legible to the crowd. Most gladiators were enslaved men, criminals, or prisoners of war, though some free men volunteered, usually driven by debt or desperation. Once inside the gladiator school, they were transformed into valuable assets. Owners fed them well, trained them carefully, and discouraged pointless death. A dead gladiator was a financial loss. A wounded but victorious one was an investment paying off. This created a strange contradiction. Gladiators were socially despised, yet wildly adored. They were mocked as low-status fighters, yet their faces appeared on graffiti, lamps, and souvenirs. Women admired them openly. Crowds memorized their records. In a society obsessed with honor, gladiators were denied respect, but granted fame. The violence itself was ritualized. Referees oversaw fights. Medical staff waited nearby. Matches followed established rhythms, building tension before the decisive moment. When a fighter fell, the crowd became judge and jury, demanding mercy or death through collective gestures. The final decision rested with the sponsor, who performed authority in front of thousands. Gladiatorial combat reinforced Roman values brutally clearly. Life was cheap, power was absolute, and order was maintained through force presented as entertainment. Watching death was not considered immoral. It was educational. It reminded spectators of their place in the hierarchy and the cost of defiance. In Rome, sport did not escape violence. It refined it, staged it, and sold it as a public lesson in who controlled life and who merely survived it. Across ancient civilizations, athletic excellence was never accidental. No one woke up one morning and discovered they were suddenly fit for the arena, the track, or the ritual court. Behind every competition stood long, repetitive, often brutal systems of training designed to reshape the human body into something useful, obedient, and resilient. Training began early. In many societies, boys were introduced to physical discipline almost as soon as they could walk properly. Running, lifting, sparring, and endurance exercises were woven into daily life. This was not recreational fitness. It was social conditioning. A weak body suggested weak character, and weakness reflected poorly on families and communities alike. Diet played a surprisingly large role. Ancient athletes followed strict eating routines tailored to their sport. Meat, grains, wine, and oil were consumed with purpose, not pleasure. Food was fuel, and excess was discouraged. In some cultures, athletes experimented constantly, adjusting meals to increase strength or stamina. Success validated the diet. Failure discredited it. Discipline extended beyond the physical. Athletes were expected to control emotion, pain, and fear. Complaining was shameful, endurance under discomfort proved moral strength. This is why ancient spectators admired suffering in sport. Pain demonstrated commitment, not failure. To endure quietly was to show worth. Training spaces themselves reflected social values. Gymnasiums, wrestling yards, and training schools were public institutions where bodies were shaped under watchful eyes. Supervision ensured conformity. Coaches enforced rules, corrected posture, and punished laziness. Improvement was measured not only by victory, but by visible transformation. However, access to training was never equal. Free men trained openly. Enslaved athletes trained under coercion. Elites often had better facilities and more time to prepare. Athletic systems reproduced inequality while pretending to reward merit. Strength was praised, but opportunity was controlled. Athletic discipline also crossed into morality. Self-control in sport was believed to translate into self-control in civic life. A man who mastered his body could be trusted to obey laws, fight wars, and respect authority. Physical training became a tool for producing compliant citizens. In the ancient world, sport did not simply reveal who was strong. It manufactured strength according to social needs. Athletes were built, not born, and their bodies carried the values, anxieties, and power structures of the civilizations that trained them. For all their obsession with bodies, strength, and competition, ancient sports cultures were remarkably selective about who was allowed to participate. Athletic ideals were celebrated loudly, but access to sport was tightly controlled. In most ancient civilizations, sport was a privilege reserved primarily for men, and not just any men, but those deemed socially acceptable, free, and properly positioned within the hierarchy. In many societies, women were excluded entirely from athletic competition. This was not because women lacked physical ability, but because sport symbolized public power. Competing meant being seen, admired, judged, and remembered. Allowing women into that space threatened established ideas about gender roles and authority. Physical excellence in women raised uncomfortable questions about masculinity, inheritance, and control. Where women did appear in sport, their participation was carefully limited and framed. In some Greek contexts, women had separate athletic festivals tied to fertility and religious ritual, emphasizing modesty and symbolism rather than competition. These events reinforced gender expectations rather than challenged them. Strength was acceptable only when it served motherhood, ritual, purity, or divine order. Elsewhere, women were present primarily as spectators, prizes, or symbolic figures. Their admiration mattered. Their presence validated male achievement, but participation remained off limits. To compete publicly would blur the boundary between domestic and civic life, something ancient societies worked hard to maintain. Class restrictions were just as rigid. Slaves could train and fight, but rarely for their own honor. Their bodies belonged to others. Victories enriched owners, sponsors, or rulers, not the athletes themselves. Free men, meanwhile, competed for glory and status, reinforcing the illusion that sport rewarded merit alone. Even among free men, exclusion was common. Age, citizenship, ethnicity, and wealth all shaped who could enter the arena or the track. Ancient sport celebrated excellence while quietly denying opportunity to most of the population. This selective participation reveals the true function of ancient sport. It was not about fairness or universal competition. It was about displaying an idealized version of society, one where power looked natural, hierarchy appeared justified, and bodies confirmed social order. Who was allowed to play mattered just as much as who won. Ancient sports may look distant, brutal, or strangely ceremonial, but their influence never disappeared. Modern athletics did not emerge from nowhere. They inherited structures, values, and contradictions shaped thousands of years ago, when competition was inseparable from religion, politics, and survival. At their core, ancient sports taught societies how to turn physical struggle into meaning. Rules transformed violence into ritual. Training converted chaos into discipline. Spectacle made hierarchy visible. These ideas remain embedded in modern competition, even when stripped of overt religious language. Stadiums still resemble temples. Athletes are still elevated, admired, and scrutinized as symbols of collective identity. Ancient sports also reveal why competition captivates people so deeply. They created shared emotional experiences, moments when entire communities watch the same body strain, fail, or triumph. Victory still offers temporary escape from ordinary life, just as it did in antiquity. Defeat still carries shame, disappointment, and narrative weight. The emotional mechanics have not changed. The darker aspects matter too. Ancient sports remind us that entertainment has always flirted with cruelty. The line between admiration and exploitation has never been clean. Bodies are still pushed beyond healthy limits. Pain is still normalized when it produces spectacle. The ancient world was simply more honest about the cost. Studying these early competitions also forces uncomfortable questions. Who gets to compete? Who benefits from victory? Who risks everything while others profit? Ancient sports expose these dynamics openly. Modern systems often hide them behind contracts, branding, and polite language. Most importantly, ancient sports show that competition is a cultural mirror. Every civilization designs its games to reflect what it values. Greeks pursued harmony and excellence. Romans displayed power and control. Mesoamerican societies reenacted cosmic struggle. Egyptians reinforced balance and order. Each game told a story about how the world worked or how people wished it did. Ancient sports mattered because they explained life in motion. They taught people who they were, where they stood, and what was expected of them. That lesson never stopped. It only changed uniforms. Long before 4 presidential faces stared out across the plains, the granite peak, known today as Mount Rushmore, was already heavy with meaning. To the Lakota people, it was part of the Black Hills, a sacred landscape woven into origin stories, burial grounds, and spiritual identity. To the United States, in the early 20th century, however, the mountain represented something very different. Opportunity. By the 1920s, America was hungry for symbols. The nation had emerged from World War I with confidence, industrial power, and a growing desire to define its place in history. The Western states, eager for recognition and tourism, wanted monuments that could compete with Europe's cathedrals and ruins. South Dakota, remote and economically fragile, needed attention. A mountain-sized idea seemed like the solution. The concept was simple, at least on paper. Carve something so enormous, so unmistakably American that people would have no choice but to notice. Initially, local boosters imagined statues of frontier heroes and explorers, but grander ambitions quickly took over. Why celebrate regional figures when the mountain could honor the nation itself? Choosing the site was not just an artistic decision, it was political, symbolic, and deliberate. The granite face of the mountain was stable, visible from miles away, and perfectly suited for large-scale carving. It also sat on land seized from the Lakota, despite treaties that explicitly guaranteed native ownership. That contradiction was quietly ignored. In the story America wanted to tell about itself, conquest had already been reframed as destiny. The mountain was renamed, stripped of its indigenous identity, and prepared for reinvention. It would no longer speak of sacred hills and broken promises, but of presidents, progress, and permanence. The act of carving was meant to transform raw nature into national narrative, turning stone into story. At its core, the decision to carve Mount Rushmore was about control. Control over landscape, history, and memory. By choosing the mountain, the nation was declaring not only who deserved to be remembered, but who could be forgotten. The rock would endure for centuries, long after living voices faded. Before a single drill touched granite, Mount Rushmore had already become what it remains today, a monument not just to leadership, but to the power of storytelling carved into the land itself. The man chosen to turn a mountain into a message was not known for modest ideas or quiet cooperation. Gutzon Borglum believed that monuments should overwhelm the viewer, not invite contemplation. Art, in his view, was meant to dominate space, impose meaning, and endure longer than the people who created it. Mount Rushmore was not just another commission. It was the project he had been waiting for his entire life. Borglum arrived with a vision that was both artistic and ideological. He did not want a simple carving or a decorative relief. He wanted a national shrine, something that could rival the great monuments of antiquity. The scale mattered more than subtlety. The faces had to be enormous, visible from miles away, and instantly recognizable. Anything smaller would fail the mission. His personality shaped the project as much as his talent. Borglum was volatile, opinionated, and deeply convinced of his own historical importance. He clashed constantly with officials, engineers, and workers. Plans changed frequently, often without warning. Designs were revised mid-carving. Deadlines shifted. Budgets ballooned. Borglum ruled the mountain like a sovereign, driven by instinct as much as calculation. Yet his intensity also fueled progress. Borglum understood spectacle. He knew that a monument of this size needed drama to survive politically and financially. He courted publicity relentlessly, giving interviews, staging photo opportunities, and framing the project as a patriotic necessity. Mount Rushmore was not just being carved. It was being sold to the American public as a symbol of unity and greatness. His vision extended beyond the faces themselves. Borglum imagined inscriptions, chambers, and historical records carved into the mountain, turning it into a literal archive of the nation. Many of these ideas were never completed, but they reveal how seriously he took the project's symbolic role. This was not art for art's sake. It was art as national narrative. Borglum's flaws were undeniable. His ego complicated collaboration, and his worldview left little room for dissent or alternative perspectives. Indigenous objections were dismissed. Labor concerns were secondary. What mattered was the monument's completion and the story it would tell. In Borglum's hands, Mount Rushmore became an expression of willpower, not just the nation's, but his own. The mountain was no longer merely stone. It was a canvas for ambition on a scale rarely attempted and even more rarely completed. While presidents would eventually dominate the granite face, it was ordinary men who risked their lives to make Mount Rushmore real. The project relied on hundreds of workers, many of them local miners, quarrymen, and laborers who were accustomed to danger, but unprepared for the scale of what awaited them. Every working day meant climbing sheer rock faces, dangling from ropes, and trusting explosives not to misfire. The worksite itself was hostile. There were no paved roads to the summit in the early years, no elevators, and no modern safety systems. Workers ascended the mountain using wooden ladders and primitive winches, hauling tools and supplies with them. Once in position, they drilled into solid granite by hand, inserting dynamite charges with extreme precision. One mistake could mean death, not just for the man placing the charge, but for everyone nearby. Remarkably, despite the constant danger, no worker was officially killed during the carving. This fact is often repeated with pride, but it masks the reality of countless injuries, close calls, and long-term health damage. Flying rock shards caused cuts and broken bones. Repeated exposure to granite dust damaged lungs. Hearing loss was common. Survival often depended more on luck than design. Most workers were paid modest wages, steady but unremarkable. In the shadow of the Great Depression, however, this mattered. Mount Rushmore became a rare source of reliable employment at a time when jobs were scarce and desperation widespread. For many families, the mountain quite literally put food on the table. That economic reality softened public criticism and kept local support strong. The labor force developed its own culture. Men joked about danger, nicknamed risky positions, and formed tight bonds born of shared fear. Trust was essential. When a worker was lowered over the edge of the mountain in a bosun's chair, he relied entirely on the men above to hold the rope steady. Every task required cooperation, even as individual names faded into anonymity. What makes the labor history of Mount Rushmore striking is how invisible it became. The monument celebrates leadership, vision, and national ideals, but rarely acknowledges the physical cost paid by those who carved it. Their skill turned abstract ambition into solid form. Behind every smooth presidential profile lies thousands of hours of manual labor performed by men whose own stories were never carved into stone, yet without whom the mountain would still be silent granite. Deciding to carve a mountain was bold. Deciding whose faces would define it was far more consequential. The selection of 4 presidents was not a neutral act of historical appreciation. It was a deliberate attempt to tell a specific story about the United States, one that emphasized continuity, strength, and expansion while smoothing over conflict and contradiction. The figures chosen were meant to represent a narrative arc. George Washington symbolized the nation's birth, the idea that independence and leadership were inseparable. His inclusion was never in doubt. Thomas Jefferson followed as the embodiment of growth and intellectual foundation. a nod to the expansion of territory and ideals. Theodore Roosevelt represented modern power, industry, and America's emergence onto the global stage. Abraham Lincoln completed the quartet, symbolizing unity preserved through sacrifice. Together, these faces created a clean, confident version of history. It was a story of progress driven by strong men making hard decisions. What it did not show were the costs of those decisions, the displacement of indigenous nations, the contradictions of liberty alongside slavery, or the violence that accompanied expansion. Those complexities did not fit neatly into granite. The choices also reflected the political mood of the early 20th century. America was presenting itself as stable, righteous, and inevitable. The monument reassured viewers that the nation had always been guided by wise leadership, even during its darkest moments. By freezing these men in stone, history was made to feel settled, resolved, and beyond debate. Alternative suggestions were dismissed. Women were never seriously considered. Indigenous leaders were excluded entirely, despite the monument's location on native land. Even other presidents were passed over if they complicated the narrative or lacked broad appeal. The goal was not comprehensive history. It was symbolic clarity. In this way, Mount Rushmore functioned less as a memorial and more as a textbook carved into rock. It taught visitors what to admire and whom to credit. The mountain became a tool of national storytelling, presenting memory as permanence and interpretation as fact. The faces chosen still stare outward today, confident and monumental, but their selection reveals as much about the era that carved them as about the men themselves. Beneath the patriotic language surrounding Mount Rushmore lies a quieter, unresolved story. The land itself was never meant to belong to the United States. The mountain stands within the Black Hills, a landscape sacred to the Lakota for generations. Long before any drills or dynamite arrived, these hills were central to Lakota spiritual life, tied to origin stories, vision quests, and burial grounds. The stone was not empty. It was alive with meaning. In 1868, the United States formally recognized this significance through the Fort Laram Treaty, which guaranteed the Black Hills to the Lakota in perpetuity. That promise lasted until gold was discovered. Almost overnight, the treaty became inconvenient. Prospectors flooded the region, violence escalated, and federal authorities chose expansion over obligation. The land was seized, and the treaty quietly ignored. By the time Mount Rushmore was conceived, this history was well known and largely disregarded. The project did not merely occupy contested land, it transformed it. Carving presidential faces into the mountain was not just construction. It was symbolic conquest. The sacred landscape was overwritten with a national narrative that left no room for the people who had been promised ownership of it. Lakota opposition was present from the beginning, but it was marginalized. Their objections were framed as obstacles to progress rather than legitimate claims. The monument was described as a unifying symbol, even as it stood on the physical evidence of disunity. The message was clear. American history would be told loudly, permanently, and in stone, whether everyone agreed or not. Decades later, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had indeed been taken illegally and awarded financial compensation. The Lakota refused the money. accepting it would mean legitimizing the theft. The land, not payment, was the issue. That refusal still stands, and the funds remain largely untouched. This unresolved conflict gives Mount Rushmore its sharpest edge. For some, it represents national pride and endurance. For others, it is a reminder of broken promises carved into sacred ground. The monument does not simply commemorate presidents. It exposes how power decides which histories are monumentalized and which are buried beneath the narrative of progress. The mountain speaks, but it does not speak with one voice. As Mount Rushmore took shape, the nation around it was falling apart. The stock market crash of 1929 plunged the United States into economic crisis, and what had begun as a bold artistic venture suddenly existed in a country defined by unemployment, hunger, and uncertainty. In that context, the mountain became more than a monument. It became a gamble. Funding was constantly at risk. Public money was scarce. Political patience thinner still. Critics questioned the morality of carving presidents into granite while families struggled to survive. Supporters argued the opposite, that Mount Rushmore provided jobs, hope, and a visible reminder that the nation was still capable of greatness. Both sides were right. For workers, the project became a lifeline. During the worst years of the Depression, steady employment of any kind was rare. Mount Rushmore offered regular wages, even if modest, and a sense of purpose at a time when dignity was hard to find. The mountain did not solve poverty, but it delayed despair for hundreds of families in the region. Politically, the monument fit neatly into the broader push for national morale. Leaders understood the psychological power of large projects. Public works signaled resilience. They told citizens that the country was still moving forward, still building, still believing in itself. Mount Rushmore's imagery reinforced that message. Strong faces, calm expressions. Leaders who had supposedly guided the nation through earlier crises now looked down over another. This symbolism was not accidental. Supporters framed the project as patriotic duty. To abandon it would suggest weakness. To finish it would prove endurance. Each carved feature became an argument that the United States, like granite, could withstand pressure. Still, compromises were made. Borglum's grander visions were scaled back. Decorative inscriptions and additional carvings were abandoned to save money. The mountain that emerged was impressive, but incomplete compared to its creator's ambitions. Survival mattered more than perfection. By the time work resumed consistently, the monument had taken on a new role. It was no longer just about honoring presidents. It was about survival through crisis. The mountain stood as a reminder that even in collapse, the nation chose to invest in symbols rather than surrender to fear. Mount Rushmore endured the Depression, not by ignoring it, but by absorbing its meaning. The carved faces became silent reassurance that hardship, however severe, could be survived, if only long enough to finish the story. By the late 1930s, Mount Rushmore was visibly taking its final form, but the project was far from stable. Money remained uncertain. Plans were constantly revised, and the mountain itself resisted easy completion. Granite cracked unpredictably. Details imagined on paper did not always translate cleanly into stone. The monument was beginning to reveal the limits of human control over nature, no matter how ambitious the design. At the center of it all was Goodson Borglum, still pushing relentlessly forward. Age and exhaustion were catching up with him, but he refused to slow down. Borglum continued to envision expansions, refinements, and symbolic additions that went well beyond the four faces. He wanted inscriptions, a hidden chamber, and historical texts carved into the mountain to explain the meaning of the monument to future civilizations. In his mind, Rushmore was not meant to be admired silently. It was meant to speak. Then, in 1941, Borglum died suddenly following surgery. The project lost its driving force overnight. Without his authority and personality, momentum collapsed. His son, Lincoln Borglum, took over supervision. But the era of grand ambition was over. The country was preparing for war. Resources were needed elsewhere. Patience for monumental art had run out. Work on Mount Rushmore officially ended later that same year. Not because the monument was finished, but because it was finished enough. The faces were complete. The symbolism was legible. Further carving was deemed unnecessary and perhaps politically inconvenient. What remained undone was quietly forgotten. This abrupt ending shaped how the monument would be remembered. The public saw a completed vision, not a compromised one. Borglum's unrealized ideas faded into footnotes, while the mountain itself hardened into finality. The absence of additional context, inscriptions, or explanations allowed the monument to function as a blank screen onto which viewers could project meaning. In many ways, Borglum's death mirrors the monument's deeper contradictions. Mount Rushmore presents itself as permanent and resolved. Yet its creation was chaotic, incomplete, and dependent on one man's will. The monument looks timeless, but its story is fragile, shaped by circumstance as much as design. The mountain stands finished, but not whole. What remains is not exactly what was planned, but what history allowed, and that gap between intention and outcome is carved just as deeply as the faces themselves. Once the carving stopped, Mount Rushmore entered its second life. No longer a construction site filled with dust, ropes, and dynamite, it transformed into a symbol, carefully packaged, promoted, and absorbed into American identity. What had begun as a regional tourism project and an artist's obsession now became a national landmark, stripped of its messier origins and presented as timeless truth. Visitors arrived in growing numbers drawn by postcards, photographs, and schoolbook images that framed the monument as inevitable rather than constructed. The story told to the public emphasized vision, courage, and unity. Workers became footnotes. Indigenous displacement became silence. The mountain was presented as if it had always been destined to bear those faces, as though history itself had chosen the stone. Government agencies refined the narrative. Mount Rushmore was no longer controversial. It was inspirational. It appeared in films, textbooks, and patriotic ceremonies. The monument became shorthand for American greatness, a visual cue that required no explanation. Four calm, confident faces staring westward did the work on their own. This transformation depended on simplification. Complexity weakens symbols. The more layers a story has, the harder it is to repeat cleanly. So the story was flattened. The monument honored democracy. The presidents represented leadership. The land was neutral. The past was resolved. Everything else became background noise. Over time, Mount Rushmore also became a stage. Political speeches, protests, and ceremonies all used the monument's visual power to amplify their message. Standing beneath those faces lent authority, whether the cause was unity, defiance, or criticism. The mountain did not speak, but it validated whoever stood before it. Ironically, the monument's permanence made it adaptable. Different generations projected different meanings onto it. For some, it symbolized freedom and endurance. For others, exclusion and eraser. The stone never changed, but interpretation did. By the mid-10th century, Mount Rushmore had succeeded beyond its creator's expectations. It was no longer just art or architecture. It was identity. And like all powerful symbols, it worked best when its origins were forgotten and its presence felt unquestioned. The mountain had stopped being carved, but it had begun shaping something else entirely. How a nation saw itself when it looked into stone. Mount Rushmore now exists in a strange space between reverence and reassessment. It is photographed endlessly, visited by millions, and invoked as a symbol of American endurance. At the same time, it has become impossible to separate the monument from the questions it raises about history, power, and whose stories are allowed to become permanent. To some visitors, the mountain still represents leadership and stability. The carved faces suggest continuity in a world that feels increasingly uncertain. They offer a comforting illusion that the nation has always been guided by steady hands, that progress follows a clear line, and that history ultimately resolves itself into confidence and calm expressions carved into stone. To others, Mount Rushmore represents something far more uncomfortable. It is a reminder that national pride often comes at the expense of marginalized voices. The monument's grandeur makes its omissions louder, the absence of indigenous presence, the silence around broken treaties, and the transformation of sacred land into spectacle, all sit just beneath the polished narrative. What makes Mount Rush more powerful is not agreement, but tension. It forces viewers to confront how history is curated. Monuments do not simply remember the past. They interpret it. They choose which stories deserve permanence and which are allowed to fade. Stone gives authority to those choices. In recent years, debates around Mount Rushmore have intensified, not because the monument changed, but because public awareness did. As conversations about historical memory evolve, the mountain has become a focal point for broader questions. Can a monument honor one truth without denying another? Can pride and accountability coexist in the same symbol? Mount Rushmore does not offer answers. It offers scale. Its size demands attention, and attention invites interpretation. The monument's meaning is no longer fixed by its creators. It belongs to the present as much as the past. In the end, Mount Rushmore may be less about the four men carved into it than about the society that continues to look at it. Each generation brings its own values, discomforts, and expectations to the mountain. The stone remains unchanged, but its significance shifts with the people standing below it. That is its true legacy, not certainty, but confrontation, not closure, but conversation. A monument meant to freeze history in granite now serves as a reminder that history is never truly settled, no matter how deeply it is carved. Long before grand temples, marble statues, or royal palaces, there was a far less glamorous problem every society had to solve: what to do with human waste. Sanitation was not a side concern of ancient life. It was a defining factor in whether a settlement could survive, grow, or collapse. A city that failed to manage its filth did not become legendary. It became uninhabitable. Human waste is relentless. It accumulates daily, smells quickly, and spreads disease with remarkable efficiency. Ancient people did not understand bacteria, but they understood cause and effect. When waste lingered near homes or water sources, sickness followed. When it was removed, people lived longer. Sanitation then was one of the earliest forms of public health, even if no one called it that. As populations grew, the problem intensified. Small villages could rely on pits, fields, or distance. Dense cities could not. Crowded living meant shared air, shared water, and shared consequences. Managing waste became a collective responsibility, whether organized by rulers, priests, or local communities. Civilization quite literally depended on cooperation in dealing with the least dignified aspect of daily life. Sanitation also reflected social order. Who cleaned the waste, where it went, and how it was handled revealed hierarchy and values. In many societies, managing filth was pushed onto the lowest classes, enslaved people, or marginalized groups. Cleanliness for some was built on labor and exposure for others. Sanitation systems were never neutral. They mirrored power. Beyond health, waste management shaped urban design. Streets, houses, wells, and drains had to work together. A poorly placed latrine could contaminate an entire neighborhood. A blocked channel could turn a city into a breeding ground for disease. The success of ancient infrastructure was measured not just in monuments, but in how quietly waste disappeared from daily life. Importantly, sanitation influenced culture and behavior. Ideas about purity, pollution, privacy, and shame grew directly from how societies handled bodily functions. Some cultures emphasized communal facilities, treating waste as a shared problem. Others prioritized separation and concealment. These choices shaped attitudes that still exist today. When sanitation failed, consequences were swift. Epidemics, foul water, and population decline followed. Cities were abandoned, not because enemies attacked, but because living there became unbearable. In that sense, sanitation was more powerful than armies. It decided which places endured and which faded into ruins. To understand ancient civilizations, then we must start not with their gods or rulers, but with their toilets, drains, and waste pits. Because before a society could build anything impressive, it had to answer one unglamorous question correctly. Where does the waste go? Long before Rome engineered aqueducts or medieval cities struggled with open filth, the cities of the Indus Valley were quietly solving sanitation with a level of planning that still surprises modern archaeologists. Around 4,000 years ago, places like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa treated waste management not as an afterthought, but as a foundational principle of urban life. What makes the Indus Valley remarkable is not just that it had drains, but that sanitation was built into nearly every home. Houses were constructed with private latrines or washing areas connected to covered brick drains. Wastewater flowed out of homes into street-level sewer channels, which were carefully sloped to carry waste away from living spaces. These drains were not crude ditches. They were lined, covered, and regularly maintained. Even more striking was the standardization. Bricks were uniform in size, streets followed grid patterns, drainage systems aligned across neighborhoods. This suggests centralized planning and a shared understanding that cleanliness mattered to everyone, not just elites. Sanitation was not a luxury reserved for palaces. It was normal life. Access to clean water was equally important. Many homes had wells nearby, and wastewater was deliberately kept separate from drinking sources. This separation shows practical knowledge of contamination, even without scientific theory. The people of the Indus Valley may not have known about microbes, but they clearly knew that mixing waste and water led to disaster. Maintenance was built into the system. Archaeologists have found inspection points and removable covers, allowing drains to be cleaned and repaired. This implies organized labor and civic responsibility. Someone was assigned to keep things flowing, literally. Sanitation was a public duty, not a private inconvenience. What is perhaps most puzzling is how quietly this achievement vanished later. Civilizations in the same region did not maintain the same standards. The collapse of the Indus Valley civilization, still debated today, took its infrastructure with it. When centralized authority faded, so did sanitation. The knowledge was not permanently passed down. The Indus Valley challenges the idea that progress is linear. In sanitation, these ancient cities were ahead of many societies that came centuries later. They remind us that civilization is not defined by kings or conquest alone, but by how thoughtfully it handles everyday realities. In the Indus Valley, greatness flowed underground, hidden beneath brick streets and modest homes. And that may be the most advanced idea of all. If the Indus Valley mastered quiet efficiency, ancient Rome embraced sanitation as a public spectacle. The Romans did not hide waste management underground and forget about it. They built it big, loud, and communal, folding sanitation into daily social life with characteristic confidence. Nowhere is this clearer than in Rome's vast sewer networks and public latrines. At the heart of the system stood the Cloaca Maxima, one of the largest and oldest sewer systems ever constructed. Originally designed to drain marshland, it evolved into a massive channel carrying waste from toilets, baths, and streets into the Tiber River. It was an engineering achievement that allowed Rome to grow into a dense megacity without immediately drowning in its own filth. Public toilets were everywhere. Long stone benches lined with circular holes sat above flowing water channels. There were no partitions, no privacy, and no hesitation. Romans used these spaces together, talking, joking, and conducting business while relieving themselves. Sanitation was social. Modesty was optional. Flush systems worked by redirecting excess water from aqueducts, fountains, and bathhouse. Constant flow kept waste moving, at least in theory. In practice, blockages, odor, and backflow were common. Rome smelled constantly, but compared to many ancient cities, it smelled organized. Hygiene, however, had limits. Instead of toilet paper, Romans used a shared sponge on a stick rinsed in salt water between uses. From a modern perspective, this is horrifying. From a Roman one, it was efficient and economical. Cleanliness was relative and expectations were different. Sanitation in Rome also revealed inequality. Public latrines were free or cheap, but the wealthy enjoyed private toilets connected directly to sewers. Poorer residents relied on shared facilities or chamber pots emptied into streets or drains. Slaves and laborers often handled the dirtiest maintenance work, cleaning channels and clearing blockages. Despite its sophistication, Roman sanitation carried risks. Sewers released toxic gases. Rivers downstream became polluted. Flooding could push waste back into homes. Rome solved many problems, but not all of them safely. Roman sanitation created the impression of mastery over nature. Water flowed on command. Waste disappeared beneath stone streets. But this control was fragile, dependent on constant maintenance and imperial resources. When Rome declined, the system collapsed with it. Rome proved that sanitation could support empire. It also proved that even the most impressive systems are only as strong as the society maintaining them. Compared to Rome's loud communal confidence, ancient Greek sanitation was quieter, more restrained, and far less centralized. Greek cities never developed sewer systems on the same imperial scale, nor did they turn toilets into social spaces. Instead, sanitation in the Greek world reflected its fragmented political structure and preference for household autonomy. Most Greek homes relied on simple solutions. Waste was typically handled through chamber pots, pits, or small latrines located within the house or courtyard. These facilities were basic, but practical. Waste was either buried, dumped outside city limits, or collected for agricultural use. It was not elegant, but it worked well enough for cities that were smaller and less densely packed than Rome. Some Greek cities did experiment with drainage. In places like Athens, stone-lined channels carried rainwater and occasional waste away from streets. However, these systems were limited and inconsistent. Sanitation was not seen as a grand civic project, but as a private responsibility. Each household managed its own mess, and the city intervened only when problems became impossible to ignore. Public latrines did exist, but they were rare and modest. Unlike Roman facilities, they emphasized separation rather than sociability. Privacy mattered more. The act of relieving oneself was not something to be shared casually with neighbors or strangers. This cultural difference shaped infrastructure just as much as engineering skill. Greek medical thought also influenced sanitation practices. Influenced by early theories of bodily balance, waste was seen as something that needed to be expelled regularly to maintain health. Clean air, clean water, and proper disposal were understood as contributing to bodily harmony. Even if the mechanisms were poorly understood, filth was associated with imbalance and sickness. Class still mattered. Wealthier homes had better facilities and more space to isolate waste. Poorer residents relied on communal dumping areas or rudimentary pits that could overflow or contaminate nearby water. Slaves were often tasked with cleaning and disposal, reinforcing social hierarchies through sanitation labor. What the Greek approach lacked in spectacle, it made up for in adaptability. Without massive infrastructure to maintain, sanitation systems did not collapse dramatically. When political power shifted, they changed slowly, household by household. Ancient Greece shows that sanitation does not require empire-scale ambition to function. It requires awareness, routine, and responsibility. The Greeks handled waste with practicality rather than pride, proving that sometimes civilization survives not through monumental systems, but through quiet, daily maintenance. Sanitation in the Viking world reflected the realities of life, lived on the edge of survival. Norse communities did not build vast sewer systems or monumental toilets. They relied on practical, flexible solutions shaped by climate, mobility, and social structure. Cleanliness mattered, but permanence mattered less. Most Viking settlements used simple pit latrines dug outside longhouses or at the edges of farms. These pits were periodically filled in and replaced, a method that worked well in sparsely populated areas. In towns such as Birka and Jorvik, archaeologists have found evidence of organized waste disposal zones, suggesting communal awareness even without advanced infrastructure. Inside homes, chamber pots were common, especially during harsh winters when stepping outside was dangerous or unpleasant. Waste was later dumped into pits, middens, or designated refuse areas. These middens became layered records of daily life filled with food scraps, broken tools, animal bones, and human waste, all mixed together. For modern archaeologists, they are treasure troves. For Vikings, they were simply practical dumping grounds. Unlike Roman or Greek societies, Vikings did not associate sanitation with civic pride or moral order. It was functional, not symbolic. However, personal cleanliness still carried social weight. Norse texts and burial goods suggest that grooming, bathing, and appearance were important. Weekly washing was common, and travelers often remarked that Norse people were unusually clean for their time. This contrast highlights an important distinction. Sanitation and hygiene are not the same thing. Latrines were also shaped by environment. Cold climates slowed decomposition, reducing odor and disease spread. Frozen ground limited where pits could be dug, encouraging careful placement and seasonal maintenance. Nature did some of the work that engineering handled elsewhere. Social hierarchy appeared here as well. Slaves and lower status individuals were often responsible for waste disposal and latrine maintenance. The dirtiest labor remained invisible in sagas that celebrated warriors and explorers. Sanitation rarely entered heroic storytelling, even though it was essential to daily survival. What Viking sanitation lacked in sophistication, it made up for in resilience. Systems were simple, easy to replace, and adaptable. There were no massive networks to collapse when political power shifted. When settlements moved, sanitation moved with them. The Viking approach reminds us that effective waste management does not always require complexity. Sometimes survival favors solutions that are humble, flexible, and deeply attuned to the land itself. In ancient China, sanitation was not just about removal, it was about reuse. While many civilizations treated human waste as something to be hidden, dumped, or flushed away, Chinese societies increasingly viewed it as a resource. This practical mindset shaped sanitation systems that were less monumental than Rome's, but far more sustainable over the long term. Urban and rural areas alike relied on latrines connected to pits or containers, rather than flowing sewers. Waste was carefully collected and stored, not abandoned. The key concept was night soil, human excrement gathered for agricultural use. Farmers valued it as fertilizer, believing it restored nutrients to the soil and increased crop yields. In a civilization where farming supported massive populations, waste became part of an economic cycle rather than a dead end. This system required organization. Cities developed routines for collecting waste, often handled by designated workers, who transported it from latrines to fields outside urban areas. While the work was unpleasant, it was economically important. Unlike in Rome, where waste disappeared into rivers, Chinese sanitation linked urban life directly to food production. Household latrines were common, especially in densely populated regions. They were usually placed at a careful distance from wells and kitchens, reflecting practical knowledge about contamination. Even without germ theory, people understood that mixing waste and water caused illness. Separation was essential. Chinese medical and philosophical traditions also shaped attitudes toward waste. Balance and harmony were central concepts. The body produced waste as part of a natural cycle, and that cycle extended into the land itself. Nothing was meant to be entirely wasted. This perspective softened the stigma around sanitation labor. Even if social hierarchy still pushed the dirtiest tasks onto lower status workers, there were risks. Improper handling of night soil could spread disease, especially during floods or population surges. Sanitation systems depended heavily on discipline and routine. When organization broke down, outbreaks followed. Still, the system proved remarkably resilient across centuries. What makes ancient Chinese sanitation stand out is its long-term continuity. While Roman sewers collapsed with imperial decline, waste recycling in China adapted and persisted. It did not rely on massive stone infrastructure or imperial funding. It relied on habit, labor, and agricultural necessity. In treating waste as part of a cycle rather than a problem to erase, ancient China offered a different model of sanitation, one less glamorous, but arguably more enduring. No matter how advanced a civilization's sanitation system appeared, it was always constrained by one fundamental limitation. Ancient people did not know why disease spread. They observed patterns, drew conclusions, and adapted behavior. But without understanding bacteria or viruses, sanitation could only go so far. The result was a constant tension between impressive infrastructure and invisible danger. Ancient societies were highly sensitive to smell. Foul odor were widely believed to cause illness, a theory later known as miasma. This belief was not entirely wrong. Bad smells often accompanied decaying waste and contaminated water, which did cause disease. But the focus on odor sometimes distracted from deeper risks. Clear water could still be deadly. Clean-looking systems could still spread infection. Crowded cities amplified these problems. Even with drains, latrines, and waste pits, population density strained every system. Overflow, leakage, and contamination were common. Heavy rains could flood latrines and wash waste into streets and wells. Dry seasons concentrated filth in stagnant areas. Sanitation worked best under ideal conditions, and ancient cities rarely enjoyed those for long. Epidemics were often blamed on divine anger or moral failure rather than infrastructure breakdown. When disease struck, responses focused on prayer, ritual cleansing, or social restrictions instead of systemic reform. This delayed improvements and reinforced the idea that sanitation could only do so much against forces beyond human control. Social inequality made the problem worse. Wealthier neighborhoods enjoyed better facilities, cleaner water access, and more space. Poorer districts were crowded, underserved, and closer to waste disposal sites. Disease followed these fault lines. Sanitation protected some bodies more effectively than others. Even advanced systems carried hidden dangers. Roman sewers released toxic gases. Shared sponges spread infection. Night soil fertilization risked contamination if mishandled. No solution was perfect. Sanitation reduced risk, but never eliminated it. What ancient sanitation achieved, however, was remarkable given these constraints. Cities survived for centuries despite constant biological threats. Populations rebounded after outbreaks. Infrastructure evolved slowly, guided by experience rather than theory. This chapter reveals a sobering truth. Sanitation has always been a battle against unseen enemies. Ancient societies fought that battle with observation, tradition, and trial and error. They lost often, but they learned enough to endure. Understanding these limits helps explain why sanitation mattered so deeply. It was not about cleanliness alone. It was about pushing back, however imperfectly, against forces no one could see, but everyone feared. Beyond health and survival, sanitation in antiquity was deeply political. Who controlled waste, who cleaned it, and who benefited from cleanliness revealed the structure of power in every society. Toilets and drains were never just practical tools. They were instruments of order, hierarchy, and authority. In many ancient cities, sanitation projects were tied directly to rulers and elites. Large-scale systems signaled competence and legitimacy. A leader who provided clean streets and functioning latrines demonstrated control over both people and environment. In Rome, emperors funded sewers and public toilets, not purely out of concern for hygiene, but to display generosity and dominance. Cleanliness became propaganda. Access mattered. Wealthy households enjoyed private latrines, better water access, and distance from waste zones. Poorer populations relied on shared facilities or improvised solutions, often closer to filth and contamination. Sanitation protected status as much as bodies. To live far from waste was a privilege, not a universal right. Labor was the hidden foundation of these systems. Someone always had to clean, empty, repair, and transport waste. That labor was almost always assigned to the lowest social groups, enslaved people, prisoners, or the desperately poor. Their exposure allowed others to remain clean. Sanitation was built on inequality, even when it improved public health overall. Cultural attitudes reinforced this divide. Handling waste was associated with shame, impurity, or moral loneliness. Those who did the work were often stigmatized, even as their labor was essential. This contradiction persisted across civilizations. Sanitation workers were necessary yet socially invisible. Control over sanitation also meant control over space. Laws regulated where latrines could be built, where waste could be dumped, and who could access certain facilities. These rules shaped urban movement and behavior. They defined which areas were desirable and which were expendable. Filth was pushed outward, away from centers of power. Even religious ideas intersected with sanitation. Concepts of purity and pollution justified exclusion and hierarchy. Clean spaces were sacred or elite. Dirty spaces were profane or marginal. Waste became moralized, turning infrastructure into ideology. Understanding ancient sanitation this way reveals why it mattered so much. It was not simply about preventing disease. It was about organizing society itself. Who lived clean, who lived dirty, and who cleaned for others were decisions that shaped civilizations as surely as laws or armies. Sanitation did not just manage waste, it managed people. When we look back at toilets and sanitation in antiquity, it becomes clear that these systems tell us more about ancient societies than their monuments ever could. Palaces reveal who ruled, temples reveal what people worshipped. But sanitation reveals how people actually lived day after day, in close contact with one another and with the realities of the human body. Every civilization faced the same unglamorous challenge. Waste was unavoidable, constant, and dangerous if ignored. How a society responded to that challenge reveals its priorities. Some invested in monumental infrastructure, turning sanitation into a public display of power. Others favored quiet household-level solutions that emphasized practicality over pride. Some treated waste as pollution to be hidden. Others treated it as a resource to be reused. None of these choices were accidental. Sanitation exposes the relationship between knowledge and survival. Without understanding germs, ancient societies relied on observation, habit, and tradition. When something worked, it was repeated. When it failed, people suffered until a better method emerged. Progress was slow, uneven, and easily lost. Entire sanitation systems disappeared when political order collapsed or labor systems broke down. It also reveals inequality with brutal clarity. Cleanliness was never evenly distributed. The benefits of sanitation flowed upward, while the labor and risk flowed downward. The clean city depended on unseen hands removing waste, often at great personal cost. This pattern did not end in antiquity. It echoes forward into the modern world. Perhaps most importantly, ancient sanitation reminds us that civilization is fragile. Cities did not fall only because of invasion or rebellion. They fell when water became unsafe, when waste overwhelmed infrastructure, when disease spread faster than solutions. Sanitation failures could undo centuries of growth without a single battle being fought. Modern plumbing feels invisible precisely because it works so well. Ancient sanitation forces us to confront how recent that reliability truly is. Flush toilets, clean water, and waste removal are not natural features of civilization. They are achievements built on thousands of years of experimentation, error, and human labor. In the end, ancient toilets are not embarrassing relics. They are proof of intelligence, adaptation, and survival. They remind us that civilization is not defined by what stands above ground, but by what is carried away quietly every day beneath our